Well, please turn over to Luke chapter 21. That's where we're going to be centered in our time in the Word this morning. I want to say, before I get started in my sermon, just how appreciative I am of all that served last Sunday. We had a wonderful Friends and Family Day, terrific luncheon out in the courtyard with so many being able to stay and so many guests. But it takes a lot of folks to make that happen, and so many of you stepped up and served. Justin and Anna do an incredible job with our events, and so a big hand to them. And then so many wonderful volunteers. So great day last Sunday. And then I just want to express how appreciative I am, even though they're not in the room right now. I just want to highlight our youth and family team of Luke and Emily, and then our children's team of Yvonne and Julie. They just do a phenomenal job. And they've got a big summer ahead with a lot happening. Keep them in your prayers. We are blessed that each of them serve in the roles that they do with our kids and young people. So wanted to make mention of that before we get into the Word this morning. Now, we're in a passage of Luke. We've been in this series now for a number of months, since the beginning of the year. Our series is Knowing and Following Jesus, and we're learning that from Luke. Who is Jesus, and how do we follow him? We're in a text today that I'm going to admit right up front is a difficult passage to preach. Number one, it's a bit of a long passage. It's a very detailed and deep passage. And it's even a controversial passage in that there are a number of ways people see this particular passage. So I've been sitting with this passage all week, reading it, rereading it, studying it. And I hope today to bring some clarity to a teaching of Jesus that is a discourse that he seems to have given from the Mount of Olives, at least reading the other Gospels tell us that. And Jesus, as you'll know, has come into the city of Jerusalem. He comes in as a king, riding on a donkey, announcing, "Your king has arrived." And the people were shouting, "Hosanna." Then, in this final week of the life of Christ, leading up to his crucifixion, what he does is, each day, goes out into the temple courts and teaches and converses with people. He highlights, for example, not only certain aspects of the kingdom, but he points out the problem with religion in his day. He talks about how the religious leaders of that time loved to be seen and to do things for a show, and yet behind the scenes they were devouring widows' houses as you get to the end of chapter 20. They were doing it to be seen by men rather than to please God. And then as you come into chapter 21, you have this experience where Jesus is there in the temple, and he sees this widow put in her 2 copper coins, and he makes the observation that this woman who gives into the temple treasury has given more than anyone else because she's given all that she has. And those who come and out of their surplus write a check, he neither condemns nor commends necessarily. This woman has given her all to the Lord. Now with that, as he's out in the temple courts, he's going in the evenings out to the Mount of Olives where he seems to sleep for the night. And then he comes back in the morning. It says this in Luke chapter 21 at verses 37 and 38. Now, while he's out there on the Mount of Olives after a day in the temple, he's with his disciples, it seems, from the other gospel accounts, and they are looking across the Kidron Valley back at the city of Jerusalem, and they are looking at the amazing, glorious temple, the temple of God's people. Herod's temple that has been made even more majestic than previous temples. And the disciples are marveling at what they're seeing. And one who looked at that temple would probably think in their mind, that temple will always be there. That place is permanent. Nothing could shake that temple. I don't know if you've ever seen something so solid, so massive, so permanent looking that you've simply assumed it will always be there. I'm sure this is how Americans felt on September 10th, 2001. If you were to look at the World Trade Centers on those days and imagine that enemies would take those 2 towers down, it would be unfathomable. You couldn't even comprehend such a thing happening. They're so tall, so strong, so sturdy. What could ever bring them down? Well, the disciples are looking at the temple and they're remarking about this incredible work of architecture. They're so impressed. Notice at verse 5 of Luke 21, some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." Now, these disciples, many who had come from Galilee, who didn't get up to Jerusalem too often, they're so impressed. As a matter of fact, Mark's gospel in Mark chapter 13 at verse 1 says that one of the disciples walked up to Jesus and said almost breathlessly, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." And who could blame them? Because Herod's temple was one of the great engineering marvels of the ancient world. The platform itself was about 35 acres, if you can imagine, about 30 football fields in size and dimension. Its walls rose over 150 feet from bedrock, built with stones, some of which were 500 tons. So, this is an amazing structure. And then for the Jewish people, it was not only an incredible feat of architecture, it was also the center of their worship. It was the place where God made his presence known. It was the place where they went to worship and to offer their sacrifices. Certainly, this temple will always stand, even though it had been destroyed before by the Babylonians in 586. Then, as they're looking at those incredible stones, that amazing structure, Jesus says at verse 6, "A time is coming when all of that is coming down." And here's the historical fact. Within 40 years, it happened. Roman armies under Titus destroyed Jerusalem. They burned the temple, and they were able to bring those massive stones down, and some still lie today where they initially fell. You can see them in the picture here at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Then notice what's next. Verse 7, "Teacher," they asked, "when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place?" Now, I want you to think about this for just a moment. Luke chapter 21 is an amazing demonstration that Jesus prophesied accurately about the future. What he said would happen, happened just as he said it. That ought to make us stand back and say, Jesus is the one he claimed to be. Once again, not only did he perform all these miracles through the course of his ministry, he accurately predicts the future. And this is before the resurrection. This is another reason to believe. But not only does he prophesy, in his words, what he's doing is he is preparing his disciples to live between those prophetic words and the fulfillment of those prophetic words. You are going to live in troublesome times, he tells his disciples. And how do you live in troublesome times? How do you maintain your faith, your perspective? And Jesus answers the question here in Luke chapter 21 with three very specific commands. Watch out, stand firm, and be careful. And as he's pointing them off into the future of something that'll happen in 70 AD, I would suggest to you that there's a dual horizon here. You have the 70 AD destruction of the temple that'll arrive within this generation's lifetime, but beneath it, there's always this deeper pulse. Jesus is teaching us as well how to live in light of his second coming, his own return. And as you read Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel, you see that both events are under consideration in the things that he says in this particular discourse. So one, he points to, and we can look back and see that just as he spoke it, the fulfillment happened with breathtaking precision. And the other event, the second coming of Christ, is still ahead of us. It's still certain. It is still the anchor of our hope. So let's talk about the instructions he gives of how to live in troublesome times. And then we're going to talk about that particular prediction that he makes and talk about its fulfillment. So the first thing Jesus says is, during these years of trouble, watch out. If you want your faith to be steady during all of this, watch out. It's a word of warning, and it's not what you might expect. The first thing he says, and the warning is, I don't want you to be deceived. Don't be deceived. We would expect him to say, watch out for Rome, because Rome had legions. They had siege weapons. They had a great track record of conquest. But Jesus doesn't say, watch out for Rome. Notice verse 8. Watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming, I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. So the first danger that Jesus warns about isn't military or political, it's spiritual. He says there are going to be false messiahs who will rise up, false prophets, voices claiming special access, claiming to have insider information about the end that everybody else has missed, and to every one of them, Jesus says, do not follow them. One of the things we've observed is that troubled times have also have often produced false saviors. As a matter of fact, the Jewish historian Josephus, records a string of individuals who claimed to be messiahs during this particular time in the decades leading up to 70 AD. Men who gathered frightened followers out into the wilderness with promises of deliverance, and instead they often led them to death. There's this man named Theudas who convinced a crowd to follow him out to the Jordan River. He claimed to have the power of Moses to part the sea like Moses did, but the Romans killed him. Gamaliel even mentions him in Acts chapter 5. So Jesus, when he says, watch out for these would-be messiahs, a string of these would-be messiahs came along leading up to 70 AD. Jesus saw it all coming, and he warned his disciples. And I think in his words, there's a warning for us as well. Every generation has its false teachers. Voices that promise more than Christ promised, or they soften the words that Jesus spoke. Every generation has had its panic merchants who trade in fear, who find in every headline a confirmation that this is the moment, it's about to come, it's upon us, the end is right now. They alone have it all figured out. Jesus said, don't follow them. Listen to my words. Then he moves to things that kind of shake the foundations of society: wars and revolutions and earthquakes and famines, terrifying signs in the sky. And through all of this, his command is stay steady. Don't be frightened. Don't be deceived. And don't be frightened. Notice verse 9. When you hear of wars and uprisings, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events, and great signs from heaven. As you read this, these are the kind of events that can fill people with fear and anxiety. And yet through all of this, his command remains unchanged. Verse 9, do not be frightened. These things must happen first. But the end will not come right away. And the reason he seems to say that is because anytime we're living in kind of calamitous times where there's wars and rumors of wars and pestilence, by the way, when's a time when those things were not happening? Anytime those things are happening, and those things always seem to be happening, there are those who say, boy, the times have never been worse. Certainly, these are the signs of the end. Certainly, it's just around the corner. And Jesus said, when you hear all these things, that doesn't mean that the end necessarily is going to come right away. Don't be deceived. Don't be frightened. None of these events suggest that God has lost control. As a matter of fact, they mean precisely the opposite. Everything is unfolding exactly as Christ said it would. The one who predicted the fall of Jerusalem with breathtaking accuracy is the same one who tells his followers, don't be frightened. These are all the things that happen in a fallen world, and they're always happening in our fallen world. Don't be deceived, don't be frightened. So, his first admonition. The second admonition is stand firm. Watch out and stand firm. Jesus had told them not to be deceived, not to be frightened. Now, he tells them what is actually coming, and it's not easy to hear. Notice verse 12. He said, but before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you'll be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You'll be betrayed even by your own parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends. They'll put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair on your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life. So before Jerusalem falls, something very immediate is going to begin happening after the church gets established, and that's persecution. Christians will be arrested. There will be trials in synagogues. There will be trials before governors and kings. There will be betrayal by parents and siblings and even friends. Some of these that are listening to him speak will be put to death. And don't move too quickly past that word betrayal. Opposition from strangers can be painful enough, but family? A parent who would turn you in because you're a Christian? A parent who would reject you? A brother or sister who would turn against you? A lifelong friend who would pull away from the friendship because of your allegiance to Jesus Christ? That's the kind of wound that reaches places that outward persecution from strangers simply cannot reach. What Jesus is doing here is Jesus is preparing his disciples not only for physical hardship, but for heartbreak. And he says something remarkable. Notice verse 14, make up your mind not to worry beforehand. In other words, I'm warning you that these things are going to happen. You're going to have to make a decision now who and whose you are. And you're going to need to make up your mind before the problem comes upon you that you're not going to worry, that you're going to trust me. I'll give you words to speak that they won't be able to contradict. Settle the trial before the trial comes. Don't wait until you're standing in the courtroom or sitting in the doctor's office or facing the betrayal and then decide how you're going to handle it. Make your mind up right now that Christ is trustworthy. And don't let these troubles coming shake that confidence. Settle it beforehand. The crisis doesn't determine what's in your heart. It reveals what's in your heart. And then Jesus says, verse 13, and so you will bear testimony to me. In other words, this persecution that's coming, it's not a detour around God's mission. The persecution itself becomes God's mission and your means of bearing testimony. If you're arrested, that's your platform. If you go into a courtroom, that's your pulpit. And we don't have to take his word for it. We have the record in the book of Acts. Peter is arrested. Stephen is executed. They bear witness to Christ. Stephen, as the stones are being thrown at him, is bearing testimony to the truthfulness of Jesus Christ. Paul was imprisoned in Philippi, Jerusalem, Caesarea, and Rome. He stood before Felix and Festus and King Agrippa and eventually Caesar's court. Every word Jesus spoke about them being tried and arrested and persecuted, every word Jesus spoke came true. And through every arrest, every trial, every execution, the gospel kept advancing. Opposition didn't stop the mission, it scattered the church, and the scattered church carried the message further than it ever would have gone otherwise. The world saw chains and silenced voices and a movement that they thought was being crushed, but what Jesus saw was a witness stand, an audience that could not have been reached in any other way, and the kingdom advanced. And then the promise comes, and it's not a promise of safety, but it's a promise of something deeper. Stand firm, and you will win life. He said at verse 18, not a hair of your head will perish. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing to say because Jesus had just said earlier that some of them would be killed. What does he mean now that not a hair on their head would perish, that if they stood firm, they would inherit life? Well, you and I know that there are those who can destroy the physical body, but Jesus has given eternal life to his children, so that those who believe in him will never really die. They have this confident assurance that even if our physical life is taken, we have a home with God. We will inherit life if we stand firm to the end. So he's not saying every disciple is going to survive this. Some wouldn't. Stephen didn't. James didn't. He's promising something that no governor or executioner or betraying family member or prison could ever take from them, that their life is in God's hands and their eternal life is assured by him. So, watch out. Then finally, he says, be careful. I don't want you to be deceived. I don't want you to be frightened. I don't want you to be shaken. Stand firm. And I want you to be careful spiritually. Notice at verse 34, he said, be careful or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. And that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. Now, notice something here. Notice what he puts in the same sentence. He says, be careful during this time not to be taken into carousing and drunkenness. We get that. And the anxieties of life. Two of those we would recognize as spiritual dangers, right? The third we would hardly recognize as a sin. And yet Jesus indicates that both indulgence and anxiety are often responses to uncertainty. I mean, if you're going through a tough time, you might try to dull the pain through drugs or alcohol, drunkenness, and carousing. Maybe I can put these things out of my mind and just kind of dull the pain through these forms. But in the same way, he says, anxiety is another way that you might obsess with fear and take your eyes off of God and lose your faith. Over anxiousness and troublesome times often means that we've forgotten that Jesus is still in control, that he is still the sovereign Lord. So, Jesus says all these things. Jesus gives us this instruction. Faithfulness matters, endurance matters, witness matters, and keeping your spiritual integrity in the midst of all this matters. Now let's talk for just a couple of moments as we close about this prophecy, because that's really the point of the discourse. The destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 was a real and devastating judgment. There were over 1 million slaughtered in this event. If you read the history of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, it was a horrific historic event. And again, the amazing thing about this prophecy is that every word that Jesus spoke was fulfilled. This predictive element fulfilled. The preparation he gave them was necessary. But notice what he says at verse 20. When's it going to happen? The disciples asked, what are the signs that this is going to happen? And by the way, when you read Matthew chapter 24, not only did they ask about this event, the destruction of Jerusalem, they also asked about what will be the sign of when you're going to come again. And as Tim pointed out in the Lord's Supper today, Jesus said of that day and hour, no one knows, just the Father, not even me, the Son. But about this other event, the destruction of Jerusalem, notice at verse 20, Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, and let those who are in the country not enter the city. At this particular point, Jesus moves from general warnings to a real specific prediction. And this isn't vague symbolism here. He's speaking about this coming destruction of Jerusalem when the Roman armies would surround the city, and he's warning his disciples in advance, you're not to stay and fight, you're to flee. Historians tell us that many Christians, because they took what Jesus said by faith, many Christians did exactly that. They escaped before the city's final destruction in AD 70 when they saw the Roman armies making their way toward the city. Verse 22, for this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. So Jesus interprets the event for us. Jerusalem's fall is not merely a political or military disaster. It's an act of divine judgment by God because the city not only rejected all the prophets leading up to Jesus, but now they've rejected the cornerstone. They've rejected their Messiah. And now this is a divine punishment coming against Jerusalem. Notice verse 23. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. Notice the compassion of Jesus. He's not celebrating judgment, he's grieving the suffering that's coming. Earlier, he'd wept over Jerusalem, and now he warns of this terrible hardship. And by the way, anybody that listens and accepts by faith what he's saying will escape it. Verse 24, they will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Again, this was fulfilled with remarkable accuracy. When Jerusalem fell to the Romans in 70 AD, the Gentiles not only took over that particular area, many of the Jews had fled, many were slaughtered, but also this becomes a new era for the church. The church becomes primarily Gentile and less Jewish. There's an old covenant order that is changing here that had been centered on the temple. And there's a beginning now of a new age in which the gospel is going to go out to all nations. And the new temple of God will not be some structure in the city of Jerusalem. It will be the church of Jesus Christ that is found around the world, wherever God's people gather. The times of the Gentiles refers to the present era in which Christ is gathering his people from every tribe, every nation and language. Then he says, verse 25, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads because your redemption is drawing near. He told them this parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. Jesus stops and says, I'm giving you all of this so that you, just as you look at the trees and realize the season is changing, will know that these things are about to happen. They will announce its arrival. Verse 31, even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. The destruction of Jerusalem, the spread of the gospel among the nations, the unfolding of these particular events of the present age all point towards the building and increase of the kingdom of God and ultimately his second coming and the fulfillment of the kingdom. Then finally, notice verse 32 and 33. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now, this is absolutely amazing. If you're relatively new to the Bible, I want you to think about this for a moment. Jesus says, the things I'm describing that are going to happen in the city of Jerusalem, that did happen in 70 AD, to those disciples, he said, you're going to see it in your lifetime. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And those things did happen. Everything that he described. When we read terms like there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, there are some people that read this and they're looking for literal things like that happening in the skies above. But this is language that you find throughout the Old Testament. This is what we call apocalyptic language. Anytime there's a calamitous event and a shaking of the current order and a judgment from God, that very language is used. It's used in places like Isaiah chapter 13 at verse 10, Joel chapter 2 verses 10 to 13, Ezekiel chapter 32 verses 7 and 8, and very specifically Daniel chapter 7 at verses 13 and 14. Where even there we read about the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. That's a way of saying the Son of Man has been vindicated, proven true. He is now enthroned, and this order is being judged by God. In the same way, Jesus is saying, when these things happen, it'll be like the earth shaking. It'll be like a cataclysmic event in the whole order of the universe. It's going to be that stunning to see. And at this particular time, I'll be validated. I'll be proven to be the true Messiah, the one they've always waited for. You'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, just as the Son of Man came in Daniel chapter 7. Now, with all that, if Jesus spoke about this judgment on Jerusalem in 70 AD and nailed it with precision, don't you want to take serious what Jesus also said about the second coming? When he said, I will return. About that day and hour, nobody knows. Don't spend your time speculating. Don't get caught up looking at the signs. Don't say, well, here it is or there it is. Don't think you know and that you've got the timetable worked out. Live faithfully, and I'll return. Don't you want to take that word seriously too? Don't you want to trust that he will come? He said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. When I speak a word, you can trust that it will come true. I want you to imagine standing on the Mount of Olives in AD 30, looking out across Jerusalem. Somebody might ask, what will still be standing in 2,000 years? That temple? Or the small group of Galileans following a carpenter from Nazareth? Every reasonable person at that time would have chosen the temple. And yet the temple is gone, the sacrifices have ceased, the priesthood has no temple to serve, But on every continent, in thousands of languages, millions of people gather every Lord's Day to worship the risen Christ. The disciples left the temple thinking about the stones. Jesus was thinking about souls. They worried about when it would fall. He was preparing them for how to live when it did. Watch out, stand firm, be careful. The temple fell, the kingdom stood, Christ was vindicated by history, and he'll be vindicated again at the end of time when he returns. He's never once been wrong. So our instruction today, be ready. Watch out, stand firm, and be attentive to your spiritual life. Be careful as we wait. We'll return next week, and we'll continue in this last week of Jesus in Jerusalem in a text that I think is a little bit more easy to deal with, but gives us great certainty and faith.